To conclude my celebration of 10 years on YouTube, I thought I'd give a bit of a retrospective on my journey, how I got started, who were my inspirations, and some behind the scenes info on all the projects that I've recorded. Things that I haven't revealed otherwise. So, it was back in high school, around 2007-2008. I'm not sure when I first discovered YouTube, but I do remember watching a lot of Pokemon Battle Revolution Wi-Fi battles. Those were all the rage back then, and one channel that I watched in particular was Overhazard. This is a non-commentary channel that did playthroughs of various games, as well as a lot of Pokemon Battle Revolution footage back in the day. Despite the fact that there were no rules whatsoever in online battles and no ranking system, something that reviewers slammed the game for, but I didn't mind, it just looked really fun being able to use the Pokemon you trained up on your DS games on the big screen and against real people too. Yeah, battle simulators did exist back then, but I always avoided them. There was always something very artificial and impersonal about battle simulators, I found. I felt it more personal using Pokemon that I trained myself in battle, rather than just entering a bunch of numbers into a program. After watching these videos for a while, I made a YouTube channel so I could post comments. But it wasn't long before I thought that I could do this same thing. Around that time, I got a new digital camera in preparation for a school trip to Japan. So, just before I left for that trip in late September 2008, I pointed the camera at my TV screen and shot some videos, which I then edited and posted when I returned. These would become my first video on YouTube, the Radiant Dawn underrated character promo, set to an overused Sonic the Hedgehog song because that was what everyone was doing back then. Yeah, this video is painfully dated. It was at a point where Z-Hark was considered underrated, but hey, this is how I started. But after that, I got into doing my own Pokemon Battle Revolution Wi-Fi battles, which would be, I guess, my first series here. Funny thing is, I didn't actually own the game. I rented it from a local video store. Rest in peace being able to rent video games. Once I had hold of the game for a few weeks, I then set about recording it, using a ridiculously complicated setup involving a chair, an upside-down washing basket, and several books with my camera perched on top of them as a makeshift tripod. As you'd imagine, this setup was very awkward. I couldn't let anyone walk across the room while I was recording because their footsteps might knock the camera down or shake the footage. These raw camera files also took up a huge amount of memory on my hard drive. As a result, I ended up actually burning these to some CDs to archive them. I didn't have portable hard drives back then. My Pokemon Battle Revolution series continued for quite a while. Eventually, I was able to get hold of an actual camera tripod so I could ditch the ridiculous setup, but even then, obviously, the video quality was not that great. But that's kind of how things were back then. You either recorded by pointing a camcorder at your TV screen. Heck, mine wasn't even a real video camera, it was just a regular digital camera. Used an emulator, or used a very, very expensive video capture device that I believe in those days were pretty hard to come by and didn't work too well. I used many different teams for Pokemon Battle Revolution over the years and had a lot of fun with it. And I eventually continued recording Wi-Fi battles once I got a 3DS capture device for Pokemon X and Y. I don't consider myself the greatest competitive battler in the world by far. I've competed at a few Australia regionals, but I've rarely made it very far. My best record was 5 wins and 4 losses at a nationals. But I still really enjoy playing Pokemon multiplayer. Hopefully when we get a new Pokemon generation on Switch, I can start recording battles again. So now we come to another one of my early series. This was again pre-commentary, the Zelda Oracle of Seasons dungeon walkthroughs. These videos were recorded on an emulator, Visual Boy Advance, which can run Game Boy ROMs, and they were recorded with a screen capture program called Cam Studio, which is free and just lets you click and drag an area of the screen to capture. There were unfortunately a few problems with this, however. Even though Cam Studio had an option that said Capture System Audio, I could never get this to work. As a result, all of the Oracle of Seasons dungeons were recorded with no audio whatsoever, and I had to put the music in post-production. Despite all that, people still liked these videos, and in fact, some of them have got a lot of views now. These videos had no commentary, but they do have very extensively documented video descriptions where I describe most of the problem rooms of the dungeon in detail, talk about all the enemies and how to fight them, and how to solve some of the trickier puzzles. An interesting thing about these videos that I didn't know until years later, but Mariland, one of my favourite YouTubers of all time, would later tell me in a comment that my video on fighting the Twin Rover is the sole reason he was able to beat that game. Apparently I was one of the few YouTube videos he could find that clearly showed how to damage the boss. I fully admit, scent seeds are not what you'd think would be the logical weakness of that boss. So I can see why people would have trouble, but still, the fact that Mariland not only watched one of my videos, but it helped him beat a game he wouldn't be able to beat otherwise is pretty surreal. One day, I might want to do full commentated playthroughs of Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Oracle of Ages was actually my first Zelda game on a technicality, it was actually my sister's. And I played Oracle of Seasons many years later and really enjoyed it. Anyway, the years went by and I mostly did more Battle Revolution videos, other than a very short-lived low-level run of Super Paper Mario, which I had to cancel because it looked awful on a camcorder. And then I did what would become my most viewed YouTube video of all time. Kingdom Hearts 2: How to Make the Ultima Weapon. This video was very low quality, included a lot of camcorder footage, and personally, I was a little bit ashamed that this was my most viewed video for a long time. But I guess it did help a lot of people in trying to make this weapon. It was accompanied by a list of videos on where to find all of the synthesis items in the game, and what enemies drop them. Unfortunately, these are now outdated because they don't include any of the Final Mix materials. At the time I made these videos, Final Mix was still Japan exclusive. Now, I'd not only be showing a little bit of footage from this video as a retrospective, but in a fantastic 10th anniversary present, just a few days before the 18th of December, YouTube decided to block this video worldwide. Because of Content ID on My Sanctuary, I only used about 10 seconds of the song in the intro to the video, and at the time, Content ID didn't exist. I had no idea that this could get me in trouble. People were just putting vocal songs from games in their videos all the time back then. Not that that's really an excuse. And I really wish that I could download that video, cut out My Sanctuary and upload it again, and that would make the video completely okay. But sadly, it being blocked worldwide is preventing it from being downloaded by online YouTube downloading programs, and I long since lost the files for it on my actual computers, so this video seems like, while it was my most viewed video ever, it's now lost in the mists of time forever. But let's not dwell on the sad stuff, because my next series was my first commentary series ever, Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy of the Holy War. Now, before I talk about my thoughts on the series itself, I want to go into what got me into Let's Plays and what got me to start doing commentary. Many people on YouTube cite channels such as Proton John or Chugga Conroy as their inspiration for starting Let's Plays, but the channel that inspired me is a little unconventional. It was a collaborative commentary channel by the name of Hellfire Comms. I don't know how many people have watched them or are aware of them, but they've been going for quite some time. They've been doing commentary long before I started. They had a lot of different commentators doing various games, but the three that were the most memorable to me were Ntom64, Fastest Thing Alive, and the Hell Dragon. Especially since it was Tom and FTA's playthrough of Sonic 06 that was my first ever experience with commentated game playthroughs. I discovered this shortly before I left for my Japan trip in 2008, and it was by complete accident. Their video on the final boss of Sonic's story in 06 just happened to end up in my recommendations one day. I watched it and I was like, huh, this is weird, there are people talking over the game footage. But I soon grew to really enjoy it. And despite it being a terrible game, Ntom and FTA made the whole experience very memorable. The moment that truly hooked me on just how entertaining commentated game playthroughs can be was the infamous Find the Captain mission. I'm going to play the clip right now, but be warned that it does contain swearing.
Basically, Sonic has to get into the other parts early on in the town, and only the captain can open the gates.
Why? Why say that? Honestly, why?
So basically, the point of this mission is there's 5 soldiers around the town. You have to do a little bit of detective work and talk to them. 2 of them apparently try to trick you and give you false information, and you have to find out who the real one is.
But just what? Why Again, it's like, why do you need to load just that little scene and back again? It's just annoying. It's just, What the hell, man?
Excuse me.
Is it hard? Is it hard? Who's? What? Yeah, fucking Joe. Please tell me you're joking me on that. Please tell me what? Excuse me for 10 seconds, please. Excuse. What the fuck?
That was incredible.
I marathoned most of their Sonic 06 playthrough, and it was around the time it was getting towards the end that I started thinking, you know, maybe I could try my hand at this. I'm not really sure if it was them who gave this advice or other people in comment sections, but I followed the common advice at the time: find a game you really love and just go for it. So I decided to take on my favourite game in my favourite series, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War.
Hello, this is BigKlingy, and this is my first narrated playthrough. I'm going to be playing Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This was actually the fourth game in the series, released on Japanese SNES in 1996, I think it was. But like many of the series, it's never been released in English. So I'm playing this using a fan translation patch.
At the time, I had no idea how well this would be received, and I thought that people might end up hating it. As a fun fact, the entirety of the first part of the prologue chapter was entirely scripted, and it took me several takes to get through it. From that point on, I decided to ditch the scripts and realised very quickly that they weren't necessary. The main problem with this playthrough came from external sources. Firstly, this game was recorded using Cam Studio, just like the Oracle of Seasons footage. The problem with that? I still couldn't figure out how to record audio with Cam Studio. So I did what I'm now aware is very common of early Let's Plays. I put a microphone right next to the speakers and recorded the game audio that way. That should explain to you why the game audio in those videos sounds very high-pitched and squeaky. Also, because I was using Cam Studio not to capture a specific window, but just to capture an area, you'll often see little bars of white on either side of the screen, and that's because I caught a tiny bit of the outside of the window there. So that's how the footage was recorded, but my commentary was done separately. All of my early game playthroughs were actually done with post-production commentary. There are a lot of Let's Players these days who hate their early post-commentary works and much prefer live commentary. I myself didn't switch to live commentary until I started on 3DS games, and I personally think that post-commentary still has its advantages. For one, it means that you don't have to put your gameplay on hold if you're explaining something. The other thing is you can record the video footage whenever you want, which means you can do it late at night or when there are other people in the house who don't want you recording. But of course it has its downsides. You can't react to things as they happen, and the commentary overall can end up feeling very emotionless and robotic. Also, it's sometimes possible that I didn't do the commentary until long after I recorded the video, and so my post-commentary self would often forget what past me was doing in the actual gameplay. As for how I recorded commentary, I recorded it in the same program I used to edit the video footage, the old version of Windows Movie Maker, which to this day I still think is one of the best editing programs I've ever used, and that's saying something. It had a narrate the timeline option that let you add commentary to a video while it was running in real time. And it let you export the file in a wide variety of formats, frame rates, and qualities. It was actually very, very good. Genealogy continued for quite a while. How long? Well, you can hear me react to the announcement of New Mystery of the Emblem in Chapter 4 and Awakening in Chapter 5. At the start, this series fell victim to the original YouTube curse. Videos could only be up to 11 minutes long. As it progressed though, that limit was extended to 15 minutes, and eventually dropped entirely. But speaking of dropped entirely, that was the eventual fate of the Genealogy playthrough. I feel really bad that I ended this series before it finished, and it was because I lost the old computer that I recorded it on, and thus I lost the emulator and all my save states. And sadly I still haven't been able to find them. One day I might revisit Genealogy and do it as a full series with actual bios and more in the style of my later Fire Emblem playthroughs. But for the time being, I'll leave the original series up as it's still a piece of my history. It was in the middle of my genealogy playthrough that I discovered something interesting about one of my other emulators, the one that I'd used to record Oracle of Seasons back in the day. Turns out, it had a built-in recording option the whole time and I just never noticed it, and this option would have allowed me to record audio. This opened up new possibilities for me. My next series, the Advance Wars 2 playthrough. This was yet another game that I really love. It's still my favourite Advance Wars game by far, and in my opinion one of the best games on the Game Boy Advance. Thanks to me finally discovering the record function of Visual Boy Advance, I was able to record this in pretty decent quality, though still with post-commentary. There was one problem though. I noticed that the videos that I recorded using Visual Boy Advance would often have their audio desynced. I'd almost given up on this project in despair when someone on Serenae's Forest forums managed to save me. Unfortunately, I can't remember what this person's username was. If you're still out there and are watching this video by some miracle, thank you for this. But they linked me to a program called Virtual Dub. Virtual Dub is a bit of a weird program, and to this day I'm still not sure what its actual purpose is. But all I needed to know was that if you put in a desynced video, there was an option you could click that says, change so video and audio durations match. By clicking that, and then having Virtual Dub remake the video, the audio was perfectly synced. So I was able to continue this game for quite a while until, for reasons that I have absolutely no idea, I also abandoned this series. Now, I think at the time I was at university, so maybe university work got a little bit out of hand and I just wasn't able to dedicate time to this. But I still can't quite remember why this ended up being abandoned. What I do know though is, I was able to record the raw footage of the entire game except for the final chapter. And many years later, I discovered the original emulator complete with all my original files on my old computer's hard drive. And so, early 2014 me thought, you know what? I've got all the videos. This was post-commentary anyway. I might as well finish this series. And so I did. And I'm honestly very glad that I did. I'm not sure this is a series that I'm the most proud of out of all my works, but this is the first time I was ever able to complete campaign with an S rank and everything. Not that that's very difficult on normal mode. And ending the playthrough by getting a perfect S rank on the map that stumped me for literally 6 months as a kid, that was so satisfying. More months passed, and I did a couple of informative videos on Fire Emblem music in the meantime, but the next major advent for my channel would be when I finally acquired a TV capture device. I remember this being a birthday present for my first birthday since starting university, because coincidentally the on-campus computer store happened to be selling it. This was the Elgato video capture, and the reason why I got this model is again Overhazard. On their channel they explained they used an Elgato video capture to capture their footage, but they said that it was unfortunately Mac only. This version that I found though was a new version that also worked on PC. Back then they did not make dedicated video game capture cards, so this was the best that you could do. It only went up to 480p, but again, for the time you couldn't really do much better. I uploaded a few test videos, including some videos of all the codec conversations in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which ended up getting quite a bit of views since there weren't as many videos of those things those days. But it would be years later until I used the capture card for an actual playthrough. The main thing it meant for me was that I could finally record Pokemon Battle Revolution videos in decent quality. A little after that time, I started a very short-lived playthrough of mine, The World Ends With You. This is another game that I really liked and that at the time was very underrated and didn't have very many playthroughs out there. Unfortunately, I ended up dropping this playthrough just like my other two, and I'm not really sure why. It must have been university getting me too busy, because it was dropped around the time Fire Emblem 4 stopped uploading as well. I actually still have the files for almost the entire game on a portable hard drive, but it's unlikely that I'll be going back to post-commentate it, because I've since found out that the game predates the DSi, so it's not region-locked. I can use it on my Capture 3DS with no issues, so I can actually record a live commentated playthrough of the game now. Which is a very good thing, because doing some of the stylus motions with a mouse on an emulator was pretty awful. Oh, and they also released a remaster on Switch, so if I did this game, I'd probably be covering that version. Not sure how likely I am to do this game in the future, mainly because Chugga Conroy has stated that he loves the game, which means that it's very likely he might end up doing an LP of it eventually, but it's something that might be considered, maybe. It's at around this point that I stopped doing commentated playthroughs on my channel for a little while, and again I can't quite remember exactly why. I did a lot of capture card videos on how to complete certain difficult tasks in games, but it was around the early part of 2012 that I used my capture card to record a non-commentated challenge run of Skyward Sword. 6 hearts, hero mode, no non-required items, and that means no using shields at all. Most of you here won't be aware of this series. It didn't get a lot of views and it didn't have commentary. But it's very important to the history of this series for one reason. While I was playing through this challenge, I would often have moments where Link died in incredibly hilarious ways. I decided these were too good to not include in the videos, so at the end of the challenge, I edited them all into one long failure montage. And this was the precursor to the Fail channel that I'm sure many of you all know and love. It's just, sometimes I find that in games, you fail in various hilarious ways, especially in a game like Fire Emblem, and I feel that these moments deserve to be shown and laughed at. So I started making that a regular feature in my playthroughs, and it's all thanks to this fairly obscure Skyward Sword challenge. It wouldn't be until the end of 2012 when I started doing commentated playthroughs again, with New Mystery of the Emblem, Heroes of Light and Shadow. My history with this game is an interesting one, and it begins during the Japan trip from 2008 that I mentioned all the way back at the start of this video. While I was in Akihabara, I ended up buying a Japanese copy of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, because at the time I didn't think that game would end up being localized, and also for Japanese practice. So when the sequel, New Mystery of the Emblem, was announced, I thought I might as well complete Marth Saga in the same language, so I ordered a Japanese copy. Which turned out to be an extremely wise decision in hindsight because that game didn't end up being localized. But here's something I bet a lot of you don't know. While I played the Japanese version of New Mystery of the Emblem, whenever I found dialogue that looked interesting, I actually would translate it myself and post the translations on a thread on the Serenes Forest forums. I was studying Japanese at university at the time, but these early translations were very rough and contained a ton of mistakes. I mistook father for grandfather a few times, I think I remember. I actually ended up making written notes on these translations as I went as well, and my translations were how a lot of people actually experience many of the new things in this game, such as the actual personalities and backstories of Legion, Clarice, and Aramia. This started out on a whim, but it's how I discovered that I really love translating, which led to me eventually joining the Ace Attorney Investigations 2 fan translation team and studying translation professionally at university. To bring things back to my actual channel though, because I was working on the Ace Attorney Investigations 2 fan translation, I was not able to work on the New Mystery of the Emblem fan translation, which was ongoing at the exact same time. But I still followed the New Mystery fan translation extensively. I loved how they were able to mimic Shadow Dragon's localization style, and I was eagerly awaiting the release of the patch. And in late November 2012, the patch hit, and I basically did a day one Let's Play of the game, with a bit of a twist. So as I was playing the game for the first time in Japanese, I enjoyed the My Unit system, because it wasn't called Avatar back then, but it did get me thinking for a moment. Inserting an avatar for the player into an already existing story and having that character start dominating the plot, that sounds an awful lot like a Mary Sue fanfiction. And so, as I was planning out this playthrough, I thought to myself, you know, wouldn't it be funny to name the avatar Mary Sue and treat the whole thing as a fanfic? And so, a legend was born. Personally, I don't hate the avatar in New Mystery at all, and this wasn't intended as a take that towards them in any way. I just did it because I thought it would be funny. And also that I couldn't really take the game seriously if I had an actual self-insert BigKlingy avatar in there. With the exception of Mary Sue, I did treat the playthrough mostly seriously. And it was the first one where I did bios for characters, but oh man, do these bios look ugly looking back on them. Yeah, they're pretty terrible. Speaking of terrible, I'm so sorry for the quality of my audio in those videos. For some reason, I didn't have access to a headset microphone at the time. I did for some of my earlier projects, but not that one. And so I thought, you know what, recording with the webcam's microphone is a great idea. It's a shame because otherwise I do quite like how this series turned out, but I understand the bad audio quality is a massive turn-off to many people. So, yeah, really sorry about that. I have no idea what past me was thinking then. Again, this was essentially a day one Let's Play. I was sort of rushing to get it out on the same day the translation released. At the same time though, I had researched the game pretty thoroughly in Japanese, so it wasn't your typical day one Let's Play. New Mystery of the Emblem is a game that got a lot of positive attention back in the day, at least from the few who actually played it. They considered it far superior to Shadow Dragon because it actually added new things, and didn't require you to murder your own characters to get side quests. These days, there's been an increasing amount of backlash against this game. And it might be because both the avatar creation system and casual mode, which became incredibly controversial in Awakening, originated here. I do admit that the avatar in New Mystery is a very bland character, but I don't personally think they're a hateable Mary Sue like a lot of people do. And I think more people should give this game a chance. In my opinion, it's actually one of the better Fire Emblem games out there. The New Mystery of the Emblem playthrough also holds a special place in the history of my channel because it is the first playthrough that I actually finished. I think mainly because it was the only one I had going at the time. And with that I realised that I work a lot better when I focus on just one project rather than trying to juggle many at once like I did with Fire Emblem 4, Advance Wars 2, and The World Ends With You. And so this series ended up being a huge step forward for me. My next series has a bit of an odd history. Earlier that year, Pokemon X and Y had been announced. Pokemon is one of my favourite video game series of all time next to Fire Emblem, and it's probably been the game series that's been the biggest part of my life. But up till then, I had had no Pokemon content on the channel, so I thought it was time to fix that. So late 2012 and early 2013, I set about recording Pokemon Colosseum. I thought this would be a fairly original choice, and one that not a lot of people on YouTube would have covered. As soon as I'd recorded the entire main story, made bios for all the Shadow Pokemon, and was ready to start post-commentating on them, I just so happened to see the channel of, let's just say, a certain extremely high-profile Let's Player, and right there was, Let's Play Pokemon Colosseum. I felt I had no choice but to scrap the whole project. I did record the game having no idea that that guy was gonna do it, but I knew that if I did release the videos, people would accuse me of copying him. And even if they didn't, there'd be no way the series could stand on its own with competition like that happening at the same time. So back to the drawing board, I had to come up with a different Pokemon game to play. At one point I floated the idea of a Nuzlocke or Wedlocke, but I soon realised that while I enjoy watching Mariland's Nuzlockes, I personally don't enjoy playing the challenge myself. In particular, I am extremely opposed to the death rules. I can do an entire video on why I don't like death in Nuzlockes, but the short answer is I feel it's not legitimate difficulty because you can just lose any Pokemon at any time to random crits. And I disagree with the notion that it makes you care for your Pokemon more. In fact, I find the very idea that you have to put your Pokemon's lives on the line just to care about them utterly horrifying. I still wanted to do something more unique than a standard playthrough though, and I was looking at other challenges but none of them really caught my eye, until I discovered the anti-piracy measures of Pokemon Black and White. If the game detects that you're playing a pirated copy, your Pokemon don't gain any experience points in battle. I had finally found exactly what I wanted. Not only had I found a challenge that was very unique and not really covered much on YouTube, the only channel I could find that did do no experience runs was Moogle Boss, but they only showed boss fights and didn't have commentary. But also, the challenge would take place on my favourite game in the series. And so Pokemon Black No Experience began. And nobody really seemed to care. This series had some of the lowest views of anything I'd ever done on the channel. Some videos never even broke double digits, it was that bad. Despite that, I still kept going. I didn't care about the view numbers, and those few that did watch tended to leave very good comments. And to kind of cut into something I'll go into at the end of the video, this is really what I care about, much more than view count, but I digress. This series ended up being really fun for me. It was a great challenge, spotlighted some Pokemon that I wouldn't have really given a chance in a normal playthrough, and led me to a commentated run of my favourite game in the series with my favourite storyline in the series. I love Black and White so much that despite this being a no experience playthrough, I actually did pretty much a full 100% run at the same time. I showed almost everything in the game that didn't require linking, including places I'd never even been to on my personal playthroughs like Challenger's Cave. Despite all that, it seemed that most people weren't anywhere near as enthusiastic about this series as I was. Admittedly, the videos were pretty bad. I didn't edit the layout at all, so it was just straight up the top and bottom screens, laid out vertically. My microphone quality wasn't great. I got a bit too angry at some moments of hacks earlier in the playthrough, and the general idea of the no experience run is a bit of a turn-off to most people. Generally, your team members don't last you more than 1 or 2 gyms. You have to keep replacing your team. In a way, it's a lot more like a Shin Megami Tensei or a Persona game. Despite that, I still got very attached to a lot of my team members. I remember Dan the Dog Slayer, the level 10 Boldor who consistently beat Herdias twice his level. I remember the Excadrill who saved my run when Caitlyn turned out to be a far more difficult boss than I ever could have imagined. I remember the Yamask whose Will-O-Wisp was the sole reason I beat Clay, once I finally hit with it of course. It was a fun ride all around, and I'd really like to do another no experience challenge in the future. Obviously there's Black and White 2, which have that ability naturally if you're playing a pirated version, but at the moment I'm more considering doing Heart Gold or Soul Silver. Those games don't have the anti-piracy measures, but I was able to modify a GameShark code to take away experience points. Not only are Heart Gold and Soul Silver my second favourite games in the series, but Johto is normally a very easy region, and I get the feeling that a no experience challenge would drastically change the way I saw a lot of it. While Pokemon in that region don't go very far above the mid-20s before the Pokemon League, so it's going to be tough finding powerful team members. I am going to ban the Lake of Rage Gyarados though, that one's probably too cheap. So anyway, that one might be coming in the future. The Pokemon Black No Experience playthrough was put on hold halfway through, because something I'd been wanting for a long time I was finally able to acquire. That year was the year I got a 3DS capture card. I managed to convince my parents to get it for me as a birthday present, though I did not get much else that birthday. And so, my Canadian Fire Emblem Awakening Special Edition 3DS, which I'd ordered because that model was not available in Australia, got shipped to the US to get modified. The capture card I got was Loopy's, which unfortunately is not sold anymore, I don't think. Which is a shame because most people consider it better than Katsukitty's. But as fate would have it, the 3DS arrived home just days before the release of Pokemon X and Y. And so after doing a few quick test recordings, I was ready to launch into my next series, Pokemon X Blind. Now, it was actually a complete coincidence that I ended up doing this game. The only reason I was able to was that I won a local tournament at my university. The prize for it was a reserve copy of Pokemon X or Y. So I thought, if I'm getting an Australian version of one of these games anyway, I might as well spend the money that I would have spent on that on an American copy of the opposite version on my recording 3DS. Before we get into the retrospective on this series, I want to take some time to mention another channel that inspired me, though this one I only discovered later, Roa Mithril. I discovered this guy's channel when his video on Quickman randomly turned up in my recommended videos, and I was instantly hooked on his videos. His Let's Playing style is very similar to what I personally aspire to. He's very relaxed and chill most of the time, and doesn't get over the top loud very much. But he clearly has major knowledge of the games that he plays, and his playthroughs always go for 100% and cover everything in meticulous detail. But another aspect of his channel that inspired me is a blind playthrough he did of Mega Man 10. The gist behind this is that Roa Mithril was a major long-time fan of the Mega Man series, and this is the first time that a new game had came out since he started the channel. So he went for a blind playthrough to show what a veteran of the series' first experience with a new game is like. This is exactly what I hope to imitate with Pokemon X Blind, though obviously this was a much longer game. This is another series that hasn't really aged all that well in terms of production quality. I still hadn't figured out how to split the screens of a DS game when I recorded it. And my computer had this weird glitch where sometimes my voice would go demonic for a few seconds. To this day, I still have no idea why that happened.
This is my first time ever doing a blind run, it's my first time ever doing live commentary, so
Another problem with this playthrough was that it was very hard for me to engage with viewers. To make sure that I didn't get any spoilers, I actually disabled comments on all the videos in this series until I beat the game. And speaking of spoilers, I also ran a little bit afoul of different people have different definitions of what a blind run is, basically. After I enabled comments, I got a few people yelling at me for knowing about past generations of Pokemon. To them, a blind run meant you could never have played a game in the same series before. Other people were annoyed that I knew information about X and Y, including many of the Pokemon, from watching the trailers. Because I had extensively followed the trailers before the game came out, I personally didn't think watching the trailers would violate the content of a blind run, and here's why. The main reason I wanted to do a blind run of a new generation of Pokemon was that I thought in my head, oh wow, I'm gonna be able to get my live blind reactions to 150 new Pokemon and it's gonna be amazing! And then it turned out that unbeknownst to me, the Pokemon that were revealed during the trailers were pretty much all the new Pokemon there were. X and Y had the fewest new Pokemon introduced of any generation. So in practice, I only got to get my blind reactions to about 5 Pokemon.
oh.
But again, I didn't know there were going to be so few new Pokemon. If I had known that, I probably would not have chosen this generation to do a blind run of. Speaking of which, in retrospect, X and Y would end up being some of my least favourite games in the series. The TLDR version is that when I play a new generation of Pokemon, I want to see them do new things, and X and Y were definitely more concerned with pandering to nostalgia than actually trying new things. But despite that, this project was still really fun for me. Looking back and editing together the best moments montage, I was surprised how many moments ended up being in there for this series. The rest of that year was pretty uneventful for my channel. I mostly uploaded Pokemon Wi-Fi Battles, finished up Advance Wars 2, finished up Pokemon Black, and also did the post-game of X and Y. There was a very short-lived attempt at starting a new series that I guess I'll cover very briefly, Age of Empires 2. This series has some of the least views of anything on my channel, and it's another series that I ended up abandoning. This was a game that was a big part of my childhood, but I'm not actually very good at RTS games, and unless you are super fast at them, they don't exactly make for engaging viewing on YouTube. So I can see why a lot of people wouldn't be that interested. It was for that and 2 other reasons that this series ended up cancelled. The first was that I lost all the files I had for my unit building and technology bios. Yes, I had made bios for everything in the game, but due to some freak, I think a hard drive died or something, but I lost all of them. The second, I don't want to say too much about this here, but let's just say that certain real-world issues happened to flare up at a really bad time in my playthrough, to the point where I felt continuing a certain campaign would be kind of in bad taste. And I didn't want to just jump to the next campaign and leave that one unfinished, so I just left the entire series unfinished, and I doubt I'll ever be getting back to it. And speaking of short-lived series, later that year I started a Wind Waker HD Hero Mode 3 Heart run, but I also lost all the files for that because my hard drive died. In fact, I believe I had an actual laptop outright die at that time, so that's when things were kind of quiet for my channel. I started a screenshot-based wedlock run on Mariland's forums to tide people over at that time, but I highly doubt many of you here actually saw that. But eventually I was able to get a new laptop, fix up the whole situation, and get started on the Pokemon Alpha Sapphire Challenge Run. As I said, I never liked the death rules in Nuzlocke, but I always liked the pairing rules from Mariland's wedlock challenges, and I wanted to do something like that for myself, but without the death. But how could the game still be challenging that way? To answer this question, I decided to add a few of my own rules, and after testing this rule set a little bit off camera, it seemed to work pretty well. The basic idea is that I'd use Nuzlocke-style first encounter rules, Wedlock-style pairing rules, but instead of faintings being permanent, I would only be allowed to use each Pokemon Center or heal point once per entire playthrough, and I wasn't allowed to buy any healing items. I'd have to make do with what revives and potions I found on the ground. With these rules in mind, I began my jump into Alpha Sapphire, which was kind of a quasi-blind run, in that I'd played the original obviously, but this was my first time playing the remake. I feel the video quality is a little better than my X-Blind run, because this time I decided to focus mainly on the top screen and add in footage from the bottom screen wherever it was appropriate. Still not as good as a full dual screen layout, but it was the best I could do at the time. Overall, this challenge was also very fun to record, and I am glad that I first experienced these games in a challenge like this, because as I discovered after watching other people play this game, Auras are some of the easiest games in the entire series. They really didn't adjust the game to compensate for the generational power creep, and it's incredibly easy to obliterate most of the boss fights. But with restricted healing, this game was surprisingly difficult at times. The final battle with Archie came down to a single Pokemon on my side. And unlike some other Pokemon fans I know, I absolutely love Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire much more than X and Y. But I don't fault people for disliking them, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. One other bit of trivia that many of you may not know, this series was intended to have an accompanying story, much like a lot of Nuzlocke comics. The story would be a sequel to my Pokemon Leaf Green Wedlock that I did on the Maryland forums. And the plot was kind of a Danganronpa fused with the Hunger Games situation, where 3 children were forced into a post-apocalyptic version of Hoenn by a sadistic game master, and had to fight their way to the championship for the people's entertainment. I did end up writing out part of this story, but I gave up partway through because it was a lot of effort while still uploading videos. But I do have in my head how that story ended, so if anyone's curious, let me know in the comments and I'll tell you. I'll give you a hint though. There's a reason why I included winning all 5 Master Rank contests as part of the playthrough. And there's a reason I used the 5 Pokemon I did for said contests. And now to the moment that many of you have probably been waiting for. Early 2015, the first trailer for what was then just called New Fire Emblem Project dropped. Upon seeing that there was a new Fire Emblem in the works, I thought it was finally time for me to do a playthrough of Fire Emblem Awakening. I already had a digital copy of the game on my recording 3DS, and I always intended to record the game at some point, but I wanted to wait for the hype around the game to have died down a bit. But with a new Fire Emblem game on the horizon, and Awakening having been out for several years at the time, this was that moment. Of course, ever since beating New Mystery of the Emblem, I had a plan for this game. It was set in the same world as Mask games after all, and I consider Mary Sue to be immortal as long as fanfiction exists in the world, so Mary Sue was set to return 2,000 years later to mess with Mask's descendants. I just want to stress right now, this was planned for a very, very long time. Including Mary Sue marrying Chrom, I actually decided on this right from the start, and the only reason was, well, he's the main character, so Mary Sue obviously wants to marry the main character so she can get the most plot focus possible. Oh, and let's make it so that Mary Sue wants to murder Sumia because she's the closest thing Chrom has to a canon love interest, in the same vein that Mary Sue from the FE12 era wanted to murder Sheeta so that Marth could be with his real true love Roy. No, I'm not making it up, that is actually my headcanon for the FE12 playthrough. You know, fun fact, I originally had an idea to do an accompanying fanfic to the FE12 playthrough, but that idea fell through. It would have involved Mary Sue constantly failing to get Sheeta killed Wile E. Coyote style. What I'm trying to say is that I came up with this entire silly headcanon plotline long before Chrom and Robin took off as a ridiculously popular pairing, and some more vocal fans of that pairing genuinely did end up giving Sumia the die for our ship treatment. I followed this game's Japanese release pretty extensively, and at least from my experience, the Sumia hate never really kicked off until the game hit Western shores, but then oh boy did it kick off, and again, I really didn't see this coming. I am going somewhere with all this, don't worry, but one more thing that I need to say first. Even the future past climax, where Mary Sue would be revealed to be the real villain of the story, kill Chrom for real, and take over the world and have to be stopped, That was all planned in advance years ago, before Awakening came out in English, and in fact, even before we knew Future Past would be a thing. I originally, ironically enough, planned to end this playthrough via a fanfiction, where I would depict the survivors of Mary Sue's rampage going on to fight against her in the ruined world and eventually defeating her. But not before Gary Stu could escape into another world, which would lead into a sequel playthrough. And then the Future Past DLC happened, which had both Morgans as boss fights and ended with a fight against the Grima-possessed Avatar in the dark future. And I thought, yes! This is absolutely perfect! Where I'm going with this is, I never intended the whole Mary Sue thing to be a take that against Robin or against the Chrom and Robin pairing. In fact, I don't know if I ever said this during the actual playthrough, but in my headcanon storyline for the Awakening playthrough, Chrom actually ends up with the Village Maiden. Back when it was still a fanfic, it was going to end like this. After the defeat of Mary Sue, Chrom finally counts his losses after the war, and the generic Village Maiden comes over to comfort him. Lucina watches this from the distance and realizes, wait, my mother is not Mary Sue, but the generic Village Maiden, and is so happy. And I don't hate Robin either. I'm relatively neutral on Robin. I don't feel strongly either way. Mary Sue was always meant as a parody of Mary Sue's in fanfiction in general, and her hatred and desire to murder Sumia was just a parody of Die for Our Ship in general. For example, if Mary Sue had married Frederick, she probably would have tried to kill Chrom and Lissa, who are probably the two characters most commonly shipped with Frederick in fanfiction. I made a whole video apologising for the issue around about chapter 21, where a lot of people reacted very, very negatively to the spin that I put on the Lucina's judgment scene. I'd always planned to depict that scene that way, but a lot of people are very emotionally invested in the mother version of that scene, and I ended up offending quite a lot of them, and I'm really sorry for that. It's part of why I did add in an extra thing to the ending of the playthrough when Mary Sue was defeated, to stress that Mary Sue was not Robin, and rather a hostile entity that had replaced Robin in the story. With all that out of the way, time to talk about the playthrough itself. This game ended up doing, for me, almost what it did to the Fire Emblem series. Before then, my channel was fairly small. I was lucky to get over 100 views on any one video. And I had a very small following of commenters, though they were all very dedicated. Recording Awakening, it was not really anything special for me. I just treated it the same way I treated everything else I've ever done, and I never expected it to be the hit that it was. All of a sudden, I was waking up to my videos having way more views than I've ever had before on the channel. Just look at this screenshot of my videos page and compare the views Awakening got to the views earlier ones did. This playthrough was my magnum opus dissonance. It got way more popularity and attention than I ever thought it would. And for a while I wasn't really sure why, but I can think of a few reasons. Firstly, Awakening is a very popular game, but I think the main reason was because my take on Awakening filled a bit of a void. Up until then, most Fire Emblem Awakening playthroughs I had seen on YouTube were either blind runs by people who had never touched a Fire Emblem game before in their lives, not that there's anything wrong with that mind you, and the few playthroughs by series veterans were mostly joke runs by people who hated the game. Shadow of Chaos' Awakening run was the closest thing to a more serious treatment of the game, and I admit it was a major inspiration for me. Sadly, that one ended up unfinished. So I guess by coincidence, it seemed like I was one of the first to cover Awakening in depth and include full bios for all the characters, showing off most of the content. I intentionally avoided DLC. I might take on DLC later on as a separate series. We'll see. And doing entire videos on topics of the game that I thought were a little bit hard to understand for some people, like Chrom's forced marriage, the way that inheritance works, and the ins and outs of Street Pass teams. I actually think these videos, looking back, are some of the weakest parts of the playthrough, because rewatching them, I ramble on pointlessly a lot in those ones. I was not very concise in my words, which is something that I hopefully got better at as I did more Fire Emblem series. This playthrough was a weird paradoxical combination of a full 100% in-depth walkthrough and a silly headcanon about a Mary Sue infiltrating the story and derailing everything. But people seemed to like it for some reason, and it propelled my channel out of relative obscurity. I got a lot of great comments on these videos, and many people who started commenting with this series have been long-time watchers of this channel that I've loved engaging with in comment sections. So, I just want to thank you all for being a part of all this. I guess I can go into something behind the scenes on the technical side of this series. So, this was my first series where I was able to show both screens of a 3DS game. However, my solution was very jury-rigged. Every video you see in this series, I rendered it twice. Firstly, I would crop out everything but the bottom screen, put that into the bottom corner of a still image, which I used for the background, and keep the sound. I would render that video.
Okay, finally Hinata's having a decent damage output. I forgot to check here some of his personal skill as well.
Then, I would import this bottom screen and sound only clip into a different project, where I then import the original video footage again, this time cropping out everything except the top screen, and putting that in as a picture-in-picture on top of the bottom screen pre-rendered footage. Then, I would render this video.
Okay, finally Hinata's having a decent damage output. I forgot to check here some of his personal skill as well.
The editor I was using at the time, which I think was Cyberlink Power Director, couldn't handle more than one picture-in-picture window, so this was the best I could do at the time. But, for all it's worth, I actually think it looks okay. I used this exact same editing setup for Fate's pre-revelation as well. Shortly after the Awakening playthrough ended, I again got a piece of recording equipment for my birthday. This time it was an Elgato Game Capture HD. It wasn't until now that they actually made capture devices specifically designed for video games. Since we've now entered an age where video game Let's Plays were no longer a legal grey area, they could market products specifically for YouTubers like us, and this is one of them. I got the Elgato HD even though the HD60 was available at the time, because this one can record older consoles while the HD60 can't. And there are a lot of PS2 and Wii games that I still planned on recording. The first project I decided to do with this new Elgato HD was one that I'd planned to do ever since I'd seen trailers for it after subscribing to Atlus's YouTube channel. This was the Lost Dimension blind run, my second blind playthrough, but this time of a game that I knew many people would not have heard of before. When I first saw the trailers and heard the basic premise of the game, I thought it would be perfect to do a blind playthrough of. A one-off original IP that was a turn-based strategy game that had as its main gimmick randomized traitors within your party. Think a strategy RPG meets Trouble in Terrorist Town. I thought this would be cool to play blind because people playing along would get different traitors to me, so I wouldn't be spoiling the experience for anyone else really. Because of the sheer obscurity of this game, I managed to remain mostly unspoiled on the plot, which in the end actually turned out to be alright. While the game did fall into the category of you have to beat it multiple times to see the full story, unlike many games where that's the case, Lost Dimension is fairly short and New Game Plus makes it even shorter, so I never found repeat playthroughs grating. The overall gameplay was actually pretty solid. Nothing particularly amazing, but not bad either. Overall, I'd give this game an 8 out of 10. Definitely far from the best strategy RPG on the market. And it does feature some of the most disgustingly broken abilities I've ever seen in a strategy RPG, like Agito's Summon Allies. If you don't know what this is, think the rescue staff from Fire Emblem if it affected your entire party and was on a character who had the second highest movement in the game and could walk through walls. Again, it's not the greatest game in the world, but if you're looking for a one-off strategy RPG that's not a member of an existing IP, this game is available on Steam, and I'm pretty sure the Steam version fixes one of my biggest issues with the PS3 version, occasional lag and long loading times. Lost Dimension came to a close much later than I expected it to, and there began one of my longest running series, but I'll save talking about that until after I've talked about a different long running series because this second series started later but finished earlier. So this was the Fire Emblem Fates blind run, yet another blind playthrough for me, this time giving the same approach that I gave Pokemon X to Fire Emblem. In a lot of ways, this run was more from my own morbid curiosity than anything else. I wanted to see what would happen if I filmed my first time reactions to playing a Fire Emblem game that I'd never played before. But as is typical of my Fire Emblem playthroughs, I also applied a kind of silly headcanon to the protagonist, mostly because I couldn't really take Corrin all that seriously ever since I saw the trailer for the face touching in the Japanese version. So in my headcanon, Corrin, or Kamui in my case because I preferred the Japanese name, was a weird eccentric person who was obsessed with touching everyone's faces, and the people around them just humoured them because they thought it was funny. I toned down some aspects of my Corrin headcanon when a few commenters found it obnoxious early on, but overall, I'm kind of glad I did this because it added a bit of levity to a character who's not viewed that favourably by the fanbase. And well, Corrin was not the only character who ended up fitting into this category. As I went further into the game, I came to a shocking realization. I like Garen. Ironically. That's pretty much how I sum it up. I feel very similarly towards Garen to how Proton John felt about Big the Cat in the Runaway Guys Sonic Adventure LP. A lot of people in the fanbase really despise Garen and just think the story would be so much better if he wasn't possessed by an evil slime monster. I'm kind of the opposite, but only because I ended up finding blatantly pure evil Garen just gut-bustingly hilarious to watch. He's a character who's so fun to make fun of. And I was actually happy when he got into Heroes as a grand hero battle for that very reason. I could finally own King Giant Ham, not a villain. Because that's the thing, the Garen that we see in Fates literally is King Giant Ham, not a villain. It's not Garen. I don't know how many people saw this the same way I did, but looking back on it and looking at how other Fire Emblem Fates playthroughs have viewed Garen, when you have a character who's unanimously hated by the fanbase and considered a terrible villain, I'd rather laugh about it than deliver scathing rants about it. It seems most Fire Emblem YouTubers have their own channel memes. This guy's one of mine. But did you know that he was not the first character that I called King Giant Ham not a villain? He's actually the second. The first was King Noctigal from Tales of Exilia, back when I played that game for the first time. Weirdly enough, the first half of that game's plot involves an Asian-inspired nation and a Western-inspired nation being at war, and actually did grey and grey morality between them better than Fates did, but I digress. Fates was a bit of a daunting series to record, because I was doing both Birthright and Conquest at the same time. A lot of people advised against this, but I personally really liked the fact that I did it this way. Not only did it make it easier to keep up a consistent upload schedule, but I think I would have got bored with the games much faster if I was playing them one after the other. Birthright prevented me from going insane from Conquest difficulty, and Conquest prevented me from going insane from Birthright's bland and boring map design. I didn't even end up that bored of Revelation, which is usually the point where most players quit. Overall, this was a fairly fun series for me, and my silly headcanons for the characters helped take some of the edge off of the story. Speaking of which, I actually came out of the game with a very unconventional opinion. I dislike Birthright's plot more than Conquest, but probably because there was so much anti-hype for Conquest, that anything I experienced couldn't have been anywhere near as awful as it was built up to be, and to me, it wasn't. Birthright, however, really disappointed me. It felt like a blatant case of, let's shoehorn a ton of random out-of-nowhere deaths just to hide the fact this story is blatantly morally superior to the other one. Thankfully though, I managed to avoid most of the negativity surrounding the game on its release due to me being blind on it, and comments were actually really respectful about not spoiling me, so thank you all so much for that. Unfortunately, I myself kind of failed here, because while the comments didn't spoil me, I had a hard time resisting looking at this game's TV tropes pages, especially when I was in the middle of boring university lectures. I'd sometimes find myself flicking through those pages on my laptop, and my mouse would roll over something under a spoiler tag, and let's just say that it's kind of easy to deduce what happens to characters if you see driven to suicide and kill it with fire mentioned under a spoiler tag around their name. Yeah. So through this accidental mousing over spoiler tags, I ended up spoiling a ton of the game's plot twists, including Xander accidentally killing Elise and Takumi being the final boss of Conquest. Both things I probably would have reacted to much more dramatically if I hadn't been spoiled. Heck, I didn't even need to look under spoiler tags to deduce some of the plot twists. For example, as I was browsing the fan-preferred couple page on the game to see which of my pairings were on that list, I found one sentence under the Corrin and Azura entry for Revelation. It said that this pairing was popular on all routes, but especially on Revelation, as it's the only route where gigantic spoiler tag. It wasn't hard to put 2 and 2 together from that and realize that either Corrin, Azura, or both would die on either of the other 2 routes. Fun fact, my initial prediction was Azura dies at the end of Birthright, Corrin dies at the end of Conquest. I was right on one, but not the other. So one thing that I took away from doing that series, next time I do a blind run, I am boycotting that game's TV tropes page. The other thing I took away from the series was that as fun as it was to record, I really don't think Fire Emblem lends itself well to a blind playthrough. It's the kind of series where you really need to know about maps in advance, and here, yeah, I did play on casual mode, and a lot of people gave me flack for that, telling me that I was playing on baby mode, and that I might as well have just sacrificed all of my characters in every chapter and not cared about who survived because it was casual mode. But the reason why I did casual is that I didn't want to have to be constantly restarting every chapter. I never leave characters dead in a Fire Emblem game, ever, even if I'm playing for the first time. But those kind of comments, combined with the fact that oh man, my early runs of some of these chapters look really clumsy, especially chapter 10, has made me really adverse to doing a blind Fire Emblem playthrough in the future. I'm just not sure it's really feasible for that kind of thing. That's not to say I didn't enjoy this series though. I still had fun with it, but it did teach me a lot of things for the future. And now onto the series that started earlier but finished later. One that came out of left field for people who'd been following my channel for a while, but it was a game that I loved when I first played it and I always intended to play on the channel someday. But the way I segued into it was not how I originally expected to do it. So earlier in this video, when I was talking about Awakening, I mentioned that I originally had plans for Gary Stu at the end of that playthrough, but they were originally very different. This was my original planned after credits scene, quote unquote, for the Awakening playthrough. I decided against this because at the time I had no plans to do a playthrough of Blazing Sword, and thus doing this ending would get people's hopes up for a series that I didn't actually plan on doing. I did always plan to play Persona 3 after Awakening and Lost Dimension were finished, but it was only as I was going through Awakening that I started to realize, you know what, the Persona 3 protagonist looks a lot like Crom Morgan. And given that aspects of the headcanon personality I had for Gary Stu in that game fit really well with what you have to do on a Max Social Link's run of Persona 3, I thought, why not? The other reason I decided to do this was the existence of Tokyo Mirage Sessions. Now, I won't reveal yet until I'm ready to start my playthrough of that game. But Gary Stu's presence as a Fire Emblem character imported into the Persona universe is, in my headcanon, how the world of Tokyo Mirage Sessions came to exist. And so, with a link to some of my earlier series, Persona 3 FES Max Social Links began. Before I talk about this, I want to give a massive thank you to Penguin Knight, the writer of the Max Social Links guide that I followed. I emailed him before I recorded the series asking if it was okay for me to follow his guide in my videos, and he replied to me and said that was fine. Which is a good thing because there's no way I would have tried this without following that guide. Persona 3 is very restrictive when going for a Max Social Links run. Mainly because it requires you to cheat on all the girls at the same time, which is the main reason why I actually had Gary Stu be the protagonist this time, because it fit with his whole searching for waifus personality from the Awakening series. I don't know if anyone else really feels this way, but I've always personally headcanoned the P3 protagonist as kind of a jerk. Given that you're forced to cheat on all the girls in order to max your social links, and they have some really dickish dialogue responses as well throughout the whole game. I know this isn't exactly their canonical personality, but whenever I play Persona 3, I always interpret them as kind of a jerk who eventually develops by the end of the game. Which is exactly what I ended up doing here, and people seem to like that. But as for the series itself, this one was kind of interesting to record because I went through multiple different editors and recording methods because this series went on so long. The first videos are not particularly great quality, but I feel like the later ones look a little bit better. I also would have switched microphones around this time because one of my headsets died during the Fates playthrough. This was a very, very long series that did require a lot of work for the bios and things like that, as well as researching on the mythology of various personas, but this is actually the one series on this channel that I'm the most proud of, and the view count doesn't really suggest that many people agree with me, but to me personally, this is my favourite of all the series that I've done. I never got tired of or burned out with this game despite its sheer length, and that's because I was enjoying every moment of recording it. The last few episodes especially, I got very emotional editing those, and I feel like they came out pretty decently overall, though looking back, I probably shouldn't have added all those quotes to the last part. That looked really cheesy in hindsight, and I'm sorry for that. My one other regret with the playthrough is how the final boss ended up. So, the final boss of P3, without giving away spoilers, is often hyped up as one of the most brutally hard final bosses in any JRPG. I was fully prepared to go over just why this battle is such a nightmare to most people, and then I ended up getting 100% of the compendium, which is something that I didn't intend to do, and I'd never actually done in Persona 3 before. But completing the compendium requires you to be over level 90, and I didn't realize, but at that level, the final boss kind of becomes a joke. I didn't think it was possible to make P3's final boss a joke, but I did somehow. Because of this, I had to actively hold back to make sure I showed everything that fight did, and even then, many of the boss's attacks just didn't look as threatening as they really should have. I swear, that boss is hard. I just was too high of a level for it, so that admittedly I do feel a bit bad about. But overall, this series was really enjoyable. I am so glad that I did not go with my original plan of playing Persona Q in chronological order with P3. In other words, breaking the project halfway through to do the entirety of Q. That would have just made it drag on even more. But I did really like how this one turned out. I'm glad a lot of people who hadn't given Persona a chance before were able to try the games thanks to this series. And Persona is definitely a franchise that I want to do a lot more of on the channel. I'm definitely going to be doing Persona Q sometime soon. And originally I only planned to do P5 because I don't have as high of an opinion of P4 as most people do, and recording the Vita version is going to be very difficult for me. But recently, I've started to reconsider my stance on Persona 4. I might end up doing that game at some point, although that would mean it would take me even longer to get to P5, which is a game that I'm really eager to cover, so I'm at a bit of a dilemma there. I might also do Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, because I feel like that ties in very well with Persona 3, 4, and Q. It's kind of like the grand finale to the storylines of the P3 and 4 cast, until they made Q2, that is, but at the time it was. The main problem with doing a playthrough of it is there's very little gameplay besides very quick one-round, incredibly easy fighting game matches, so I don't think it would be a very enjoyable series to watch or commentate on. I might as well say here that regarding other SMT games, I'm not really a fan of the mainline Shin Megami Tensei series for various reasons that I don't want to go into here, but there is the chance I may cover the Digital Devil Saga games someday because I really like those and their battle system is often said to be very similar to Tokyo Mirage Sessions. Devil Survivor is also something that I might cover in the future. I recently bought Devil Survivor 2 on an eShop sale. I'm gonna just have to play that game for myself and see if I end up enjoying it though. So those are my thoughts on Persona out of the way. Next up is another blind run that came kind of out of left field for this channel. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney's Spirit of Justice. This fell in a similar category to Pokemon X and Fire Emblem Fates. A new game had just come out in a series that I've been a long time fan of, so I wanted to play it blind on the channel. There have been a lot of blind Ace Attorney playthroughs on YouTube by some pretty high profile people, but the majority of them got into the series far later than I did. By the time blind Ace Attorney playthroughs were even a thing, I'd already played every game up until Dual Destinies. So I understand why some people might have been turned off by this. This is jumping in quite late in the series, but the good thing about Ace Attorney games is that most of them are relatively self-contained besides a few callbacks to earlier games or callbacks to character development from past games. I was hoping that through this, I'd get some people to check out the earlier Ace Attorney games, and because of that, I avoided directly spoiling them in my commentary. And speaking of which, due to the incredibly story-driven nature of this game, I didn't include anything from it in my best moments montages, and I won't be showing any video footage of it here. This project was a big step forward for me in terms of blind runs because I did what I should have done with Fire Emblem Fates. Boycotted the game's TV tropes page until I'd finished it. I also did not post any videos on the game until I'd already recorded most of it. Through this method, I was able to remain unspoiled on virtually everything, except some jerk on Tumblr did manage to spoil the identity of the main villain for me. So I've learned a new lesson. When you're planning a blind playthrough, never ever discuss that game in any capacity on any kind of social media. Anyway, I really enjoyed this series. It helps that this game ended up becoming my third favourite in the series. I really like this one and highly recommend it to anyone who likes the series, especially if you were a bit disappointed by Dual Destinies. I've seen a lot of people saying this game's a big improvement over that one. After all was said and done, the only real issue I have with the game, though it's a fairly big one, is that the main prosecutor is pretty bad. But if you can get past that, this has some really great cases. I hope you all enjoyed getting to hear my thought process, which plot twists I predicted ahead of time. Overall, again, this was a very fun series for me to record, and it also helped give me something I could upload in downtime periods while I was sick or busy with other things. Having a blind run recorded in advance is something that I might actually do going forward, though, like I said, I won't be revealing anything about games I plan to play blind before I start doing them, just to be absolutely sure to avoid spoilers. A bit of behind the scenes info on the recording process of this project. This was the first 3DS game where I actually was able to properly split the screens in an editor. I used Lightworks for this, which is a freeware editing program that does allow multiple video tracks. And through fiddling with some crop presets, I was able to create some templates that would move the screens to where I needed them to be. I have to thank Edison T. Crux for this. He did a tutorial video on how to make a Pokemon layout in Lightworks, and that's what I modified to use for this. I now use Lightworks for most of my projects, though I feel its quality is not the best, and I might be upgrading to a new editor eventually. Next up is a very quick playthrough of Crash Bandicoot 2 that I did because I needed a short project after the monster that was Persona 3. There wasn't much to this series, but I might cover other shorter platform game projects in the future. It might not look like it from my channel, but I'm actually a pretty big fan of 100% collectathon platformers. The only thing I can say for now is that I do plan to cover the Spyro Reignited trilogy someday. However, I won't make any promises as to when, because that is in fact going to be a co-commentary series with my sister, so it will all depend on when she's available and when she's feeling up to it. As it stands though, this project was short, a nice breather after the longer project I did before, nothing much else to say. After a slight break from the series, I was back to Fire Emblem with the Sacred Stones. Sacred Stones and Radiant Dawn were the next two Fire Emblem games on my list after I finished Fates. However, I originally planned to do Radiant Dawn first, but at the time, Echoes had just released, so I thought Sacred Stones was a little bit more topical. I'm really glad that I did not go with my original plan for Radiant Dawn then, because, well, I'll get to that when I cover Radiant Dawn. Now, you might not know this, but Sacred Stones was a bit of a weird project for me, and in some ways I feel it's a lowlight of my channel. I recorded the first 5 chapters in advance and was really excited to start posting them. Once I posted them though, I found that the comments were full of a lot more heated discussions than I was expecting. Now I'll just say this, I have nothing against the low turn count and efficiency playstyles, or people who play by those, but I never expected that Sacred Stones would be such a hotspot for that kind of heated character viability discussion. I mean, it's one of the easiest games in the series, it has endless grinding, and it gives you a character in the very first chapter who's capable of soloing the entire game. Back when this game first came out, most of the more hardcore quote-unquote members of the community would not have touched this with a 10-foot pole. My playthrough of the game was a lot more casual because that's how I expected the fandom treated it, but it turns out it's actually quite the opposite these days. I often found myself waking up to the comment section of the newest videos and seeing it full of some very angry flame wars between multiple people, and that was a bit disheartening to me. But there's another side to this story. I think I reacted to this way too harshly, because at the time I was recording Sacred Stones, I was also going through a very major bout of depression for personal real-life reasons that I won't go into here. But suffice to say, I was feeling very down at that point in my life, and I may have overreacted to some of the commenters because of this, and I'm very, very sorry. Some of the people who did start these character viability debates in the comments have gone on to become regular commenters on my channel and are actually really nice people who I've loved talking with. So again, I'm really sorry if I overreacted or I was overly harsh on those kind of comments back at the time. I just wasn't really myself back then. The good news is that later that year I was able to see a therapist, and as a result I felt a lot better about myself overall, and I was able to bounce back from that depression. Looking back, there were some pretty good moments from the Sacred Stones run overall, but it doesn't feel like it's the best Fire Emblem series I've done. I still really like Sacred Stones as a Fire Emblem game. I think its soundtrack is one of the best on the Game Boy Advance and is highly underrated. I think its characters are some of the best in the series. There's so few characters that were able to really develop all of them quite well. I especially love the art style used for the official arts. Sachiko Wada seriously needs to draw more characters, her art style is amazing. So I'm glad that I was able to show this game off. Next we come to a very strange series of mine. You might remember from earlier in the video that I recorded a run of Pokemon Colosseum much earlier but decided to scrap it. Around that time, I found a portable hard drive that happened to have all of the original video files for that project. I was also still in my period of depression, so wasn't really feeling up to recording a new live series. But I could post-commentate on these existing videos, and I felt that it had been such a long time since that other playthrough of Colosseum, and it was a shame to let all these videos go to waste. So, the Pokemon Colosseum revival began. This was an interesting project as it was my first experience with syncing commentary to a video, which is a lot harder to do in post than it is live. I ended up using Pokeball shakes for catching Shadow Pokemon as a way to test if the footage was synced properly. I would say 1, 2, 3 as the ball shook in my commentary and sync that up in post. For the most part that worked, but it wasn't perfect, and it turns out that syncing up the commentary was a much more difficult process than I'd anticipated. Also, this being video footage that I recorded a long time ago, it obviously does not look that great. This was all recorded with my old Elgato game capture, not the HD. But it was great to finally be doing a Pokemon game again. I've got a lot I can say about that series after all. In fact, that series gave me the Pokemon craze so much that I decided to immediately launch into Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. This time it was in fact live commentary, and I recorded this as I was going through, but I always wanted to cover this game, and again, after Colosseum, I just really felt like playing the sequel. But speaking of which, this playthrough was also my first foray into playing an original game and its sequel back to back. This was going to be a test for my planned attempt of Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn later that year, as well as my eventual planned coverage of the Trails series games, which, well, anyone who's played those games know they end on cliffhangers so trollish that you have to play the sequel right after the original. Pokemon XD overall, I feel is a series that I probably had more fun with than the viewers did. I really enjoyed this game, but many comments said they preferred my playthrough of Colosseum. partly due to that being kind of original for my channel at the time, whereas this series was a Pokemon project right after another Pokemon project. I get that. The thing is, I have a very unconventional opinion on these two games. I personally enjoy XD far, far, far more than Colosseum. Always have, right from the first moment it came out. But to a lot of fans, Colosseum sticks out more due to its more memorable protagonist and general darker tone. But to me, XD's gameplay refinements, better graphics, better selection of shadow Pokemon, and really, really cool boss fights, especially towards the end of the game, make it so much more memorable. At the end of this series, I also covered all the battle CDs, because they're an element of the game that I personally really like. In fact, if you played Fire Emblem Heroes, the tactics drills are very, very similar conceptually to XD's battle CDs. I really enjoyed showing these because a lot of them are actually very cool in my opinion, and it gave me an opportunity to talk about things that have changed game mechanics wise from Gen 3 until now. So overall, like I said, XD's a series that I probably enjoyed more than the viewers did, but it was still a fun project to do. It was followed by something that I had been promising for a long time, but finally got around to doing. Persona 3 FES The Answer. Like the XD Battle CDs, the main reason I decided to cover this was that it's something that not a lot of YouTubers did. In fact, a Persona 3 playthrough by a relatively high-profile channel didn't cover the answer at all, and instead just did a single video where they explain why they hate the answer, don't consider it canon, and won't be covering it. I always felt like the answer was part of the game though, and that I wanted to show it because again, so few people actually do. I can understand why not a lot of people decide to cover it, because the majority of it is plotless dungeon crawling, and the few elements of plot that it does have are incredibly controversial. The vast majority of people just watch the final boss and the cutscenes of the answer and that's it. However, in playing through the answer, I hope to show people that some of the dungeon crawling isn't quite as boring as many people think. One thing I find a bit underrated about the answer is many of the palette-swapped enemies have really cool-looking designs. Something that I wish was done more in the journey, because its palette swaps were usually a bit boring. I also feel the boss fights in the answer are very creatively designed, even though some of the later ones can be a bit brutal. I hope some people gained a new appreciation for the answer after this series, and yeah, I still really don't like what it does to Yukari, but I do really like its final boss, and the way the answer ends is surprisingly heartwarming. I can fully see why this mode is controversial, but I found some elements of it that did surprise me in how good they were. So maybe some of you share that opinion. I don't know. We're getting closer to the end of the 10 years, starting with Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, a Fire Emblem game that I originally never planned to do a playthrough of, because for a while this game was done to death, not just by dedicated Fire Emblem channels, but even by some non-Fire Emblem channels. I was also worried due to how hard the game is to get hold of these days and how obnoxiously expensive it can be. I originally only planned to cover Radiant Dawn, but thinking about it in more detail, and after replaying Path of Radiance again for myself, I realised all of the hints at plot points in Radiant Dawn that were seeded ever since early Path of Radiance, and I felt that you'd miss a lot if you launched straight into Radiant Dawn, so I decided to do this playthrough first. It also meant that if I did a transfer bonuses file, you'd get to physically see the same characters used across both games, which I thought was a cool idea. That's also a bit of a novelty these days, as due to the way that these games are hard to obtain, not a lot of people have access to transfer bonuses now. This series was interesting from a technical standpoint, as it was the first time where I recorded commentary as a separate file to the game audio. In some of my earlier playthroughs, especially of Persona 3, you might have noticed there were points where the entire audio would just cut out. That's because if I said something wrong during my commentary, there was no way I could specifically cut the commentary without also cutting the game audio, because both were fused together in the outputted file. Starting with Path of Radiance, I had the commentary as a separate file to the video, so I was able to edit it separately from the video audio. That meant that I still needed to find a way to sync up the audio with the video, but that was a lot easier now that I was recording live. The way I do it, as you might have seen in some of my videos where I forgot to cut this part out, is I go to the File Select menu and just move the cursor down through the files and up again while saying down, 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 up, etc. and that's what I used to sync the audio. Personally, I felt the overall visual quality of this series did not look that great. It's kind of hard to make GameCube footage look good on the editing program that I'm using. It needs to be blown up a little bit. And my Elgato Game Capture HD can only capture good-looking GameCube footage in 30 FPS rather than 60 FPS for some reason. So Path of Radiance may have looked a bit slow as well. Overall, I have a very neutral opinion on this series. It's not my favourite by far, but I don't particularly dislike it either. This is actually very similar to how I feel about the game itself. I don't hold Path of Radiance in nearly as high regard as a lot of other Fire Emblem fans do. I do still really like the game though, so hopefully I didn't get too negative in my commentary at any point. But for the most part, this series was mainly done as a stepping point into the next one, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. This is a playthrough that had been in the works for years, longer than maybe even Awakening actually. My desire to do a playthrough stemmed from the fact that most full playthroughs of Radiant Dawn I had seen from other Fire Emblem YouTubers were done by people who hate the game. Not that there's anything wrong with that, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, and Radiant Dawn does have a lot of flaws. As I said in the playthrough itself, it's a game that I like in spite of some of the biggest flaws that I've liked something in spite of. But I really wanted to get a more positive playthrough of the game on YouTube, and that's what I sought to do with this series. I was able to find a method that recorded in 60 FPS for this one, which was nice. And you might wonder why I actually played the game at 4:3 rather than 16:9, and that's because if you play the game at 16:9, you get these really ugly looking bars on the sides of the dialogue scenes, and it just looks really awkward to me. Radiant Dawn was not natively at 16:9, that option was added for the English version, and I personally feel that it's not that necessary. But anyway, I know quite a bit about Radiant Dawn, and I've learned even more over the years through watching speedruns and researching information from other sources. So, hopefully I was able to convey as much as I could. There was one story about Radiant Dawn, however, that I was not able to go over during the playthrough itself, so I guess I can talk about it here. Radiant Dawn holds a special place in my heart because this was a game that I wanted so badly, I actually sent a physical mail to Nintendo Australia complaining about them taking 6 months to release it over here. Yeah, the European version of Radiant Dawn, which is the region that Australia is in, didn't release until 6 months after the American version. I did eventually get a reply from Nintendo about it, but by that point the game's release date had already been announced, and it was mostly just a generic response, but it's nice that they actually paid attention to me. So then the release date finally approached, and I was all excited to pick it up one day after school from the local game store, and I got there and they told me the game had been delayed another week. This has never happened for any other game that I followed, and I was really upset at the time. I know that it sounds really whiny, but I mean, I was a teenager back then, and seriously, I had to wait 6 months only to be told, oh, it's going to be delayed even longer. They did give me a couple of coloured third-party Wii Remote jackets to compensate, so thanks, I guess. I actually wanted this game so badly that I imported an American copy and got my Wii modded to remove the region locking, or so I thought. I was foiled by one thing: the system updates. This game unfortunately came with a system update in the American version, and installing an update that's not native to your console's region will brick the console. So unfortunately, I was punished for importing a legitimate copy of the game, when I would not have been punished if I had illegally downloaded a ROM and patched out the update. And this is why region locking is a terrible idea, and thank you so much Nintendo for not applying it to the Switch. Okay, rant over. Back to the actual Radiant Dawn playthrough. This being a game that I really love, I did enjoy recording this one, but there were a few times where it did start to drag a bit, and doing Colosseum and XD back-to-back was mostly fine because they're fairly short series, but Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are both pretty long, and I also had a lot of unforeseen complications during the Radiant Dawn playthrough. I got problems with my neck, I had to go away on a holiday, and then I got horrendously sick in November of this year, and was out of action for that entire month. So apologies for all the delays in that series. It didn't help that the point where the delays mostly hit was pre-endgame part 4, which I still feel is by far the worst part of Radiant Dawn gameplay-wise. I don't really mind those chapters where I'm playing the game on my own time because I can do something else in the background, but actually recording and commentating on those really long, monotonous route chapters, that was kind of a pain. I have looked far less favourably on that part of the game ever since doing this playthrough. Hopefully though, Endgame made up for it. I love Radiant Dawn Endgame so much, and I hope I was able to convey that enthusiasm in those videos. But yeah, Radiant Dawn was a very long project, but I hope it turned out decently well. Though I might be taking another break from Fire Emblem after that. And so, those are my thoughts on every project that I've done. But there's one last thing that I want to say for my 10th anniversary, and that is, to all of you in my comments section, thank you. I'm really doing this for all of you. What I live for uploading YouTube videos is seeing the comments of these videos every morning, getting to reply to them, seeing the discussion. I have such a great community here. You're all so nice, there's barely any hostility or flame wars at all. Your comments are always really insightful, and they're what motivates me to keep going. I really hope this community continues to be as positive as it is going forward. And once again, thank you all. And with that, here's to another 10 years. I'll see you in my next project.